Let's jump right into this explainer covering the federal regulations that actually control what gets safely added to our food. If you work in the food and beverage industry, maybe you handle compliance for a manufacturing facility, or honestly, if you're just someone who likes knowing what's in your groceries, getting a handle on this regulatory landscape is absolutely crucial. Today, we're unpacking a massive, highly detailed set of federal rules that essentially acts as the ultimate bouncer for our food supply.
Think about it for a second. Have you ever wondered who exactly decides how much preservative is allowed in your morning cereal? Or how they figure out the precise chemical limits for the flavorings in your favorite soda? It doesn't just happen by accident, and there is no way manufacturers are just left to guess. The answers actually live inside a really dense regulatory framework called Title 21, Part 172. It's basically the ultimate federal rulebook for direct food additives. It dictates the what, the how, and the how much, making sure everything we consume is standardized and, above all, safe.
Since this legal text is pretty massive, we've broken it down into some logical buckets for you. We're going to cover decoding food additive rules, the golden rules of manufacturing, strict limits and purity tests, mandatory labeling and directions, real-world additive examples, and finally, the stakes of non-compliance. All right, let's get to it.
Section 1. Decoding food additive rules.
Okay, so let's establish the foundation of what this specific regulation actually governs. Before we even touch on specific chemicals or preservatives, we have to look at the baseline expectations the government sets for any facility handling these substances. This whole regulatory text is built squarely on the bedrock concept of good manufacturing practice, or GMP. What this means is any food additive has to be of a safe, appropriate grade. It must be handled with the utmost care, and here's the real kicker. It should only be used in the absolute minimum amount needed to do its intended job. You can't just dump extra preservative into a batch of dough just to play it safe, you know? The law absolutely requires precision and restraint.
Section 2. The Golden Rules of Manufacturing.
Let's translate those high-level legal concepts into the actual, specific actions required right on the factory floor. If you're manufacturing food, here is the core sequence of expectations placed on you. Step 1. Verify the additive is strictly food grade, meaning it's been purified and tested specifically for human consumption, not just some industrial use. Step 2. Handle it with the exact same care as a primary food ingredient. You aren't leaving it sitting wide open in a dusty warehouse. It gets treated like actual food. And Step 3. Use only the minimum quantity needed to get the job done. If 1 milligram stabilizes your product, you are literally in violation if you use 2 milligrams just because it's cheaper to pour than to measure.
Now, I want to clarify a really common point of confusion here. Following this specific additive regulation doesn't just give you a free pass on all the other overarching food safety laws. If you perfectly measure and label a permitted artificial sweetener, but your factory has, say, a major sanitation problem, you're still violating the broader Federal Food Safety Acts. Part 172 is just one highly specialized piece of a much larger compliance puzzle. You still have to satisfy this rulebook right alongside every other health and safety standard out there.
Moving on to Section 3. Strict limits and purity tests.
So, how does the government actually enforce the chemical boundaries of these ingredients? Well, it's not just about what you use, but how pure it actually is. Rather than listing out endless, incredibly hard-to-pronounce chemical names, it helps to broadly categorize this massive list of approved additives by their functional boundaries. For preservatives, the goal is to prevent spoilage, right? And the regulatory boundary is incredibly strict, often capped at exact parts per million limits. For nutritional supplements, like adding vitamins or amino acids, the amounts have to align with specific dietary and medical thresholds. Flavorings, which obviously enhance taste, are generally governed by that minimum quantity rule we just talked about. And coatings, like the wax used to protect fresh produce, well, those must be formulated from highly specific pre-approved resins. So basically, every category has its own distinct regulatory fence.
And to stay inside that fence, these chemical additives have to undergo some intense laboratory scrutiny and mandatory purity testing before they ever come close to your plate. The regulations literally mandate screening for heavy metals like lead and arsenic to ensure they stay below microscopic limits. Labs conduct specific molecular weight analyses to verify the compound is exactly what it claims to be. They're checking for specific acid values and melting points. And you might be wondering, why does a melting point matter? Well, because if a chemical melts at the wrong temperature, it's a huge red flag that the compound is impure, or maybe even a completely different, unsafe substance entirely. There's even strict zero-tolerance enforcement for certain chemical residues in things like dairy products. This is highly technical, incredibly rigorous scientific verification.
Section 4. Mandatory labeling and directions. Okay, So putting the right chemical in isn't enough. We have to talk about the paperwork, because the communication surrounding these additives is just as heavily regulated. Before an additive even reaches the manufacturing floor, it has to follow some incredibly strict labeling requirements. The packaging has to clearly declare the specific recognized name of the additive. If it's marketed in a mixture with other ingredients, the exact percentages and concentrations have to be stated right there on the label. The manufacturer is also required to provide comprehensive usage directions. And if the additive is being used as a sugar substitute, the packaging must prominently display its sweetening equivalents, just so buyers know exactly how it compares to standard sugar.
Now, why does the government care so much about the instruction manual for these additives? It's pretty simple, really. Providing clear directions ensures that downstream consumers and food preparers don't accidentally exceed safe consumption thresholds. Imagine a bakery buying a commercial dough conditioner. The label's precise instructions are the only thing stopping them from using way too much and accidentally creating a product that violates federal safety limits. The label is basically the very first line of defense in food safety. Section 5. Real-world additive examples.
Let's ground all of this in reality for a second and see how these dense, highly technical rules actually apply to the everyday items you toss into your grocery cart. Take the number 200. In the context of this regulation, if you're buying smoked salmon, the specific preservatives used to cure that fish are strictly capped at exactly 200 parts per million. Not 205, not 210, exactly 200. This highly specific number is legally binding to guarantee safe consumption while still allowing the fish to actually be properly preserved for transport and sale.
And here's a really common compliance misconception you'll want to watch out for. The rules clearly state that adding a regulated vitamin or amino acid to your food product does not automatically classify it as a required dietary supplement. So, just because a food scientist adds vitamin D to a breakfast cereal or an amino acid to a protein bar, the government does not automatically endorse that food as a necessary medical or dietary supplement for humans. All it means is the additive itself is safe for consumption under those defined limits.
Honestly, the sheer scope of this regulation is pretty staggering once you start paying attention. From the invisible protective wax coated on fresh citrus fruits in the produce aisle, all the way to the complex synthetic flavorings that give soft drinks their distinct taste, every single addition has a precise regulatory rulebook behind it. Every emulsifier, every thickener, every artificial sweetener, it literally all traces back to the strict guidelines laid out in these federal codes.
And finally, Section 6, the stakes of noncompliance. Let's look at why ignoring these meticulous rules is basically a recipe for disaster. The legal risks and real-world implications of failing to meet these strict safety standards are severe. If a manufacturer tries to bypass these rules, they are failing to meet mandatory safety and purity standards. That means unvetted, potentially contaminated ingredients could literally enter the food supply. By doing that, they're directly risking dangerous toxicity levels for consumers, whether that's from heavy metal exposure or chemical overconcentration. And from a pure business standpoint, ignoring these rules means directly violating federal acts and regulations. We're talking massive fines, forced product recalls, and severe legal action. This is absolutely why compliance teams are the unsung heroes of the food industry. Because compliance isn't just a suggestion, right? It's the law.
So, the next time you sit down for a meal, will you take a second to ponder the massive, invisible regulatory framework that keeps every bite safe? It is so easy to take our food supply for granted, but behind every single packaged good is a rigorous, scientifically backed system designed to protect you and me. Thanks so much for joining me as we unpacked these critical compliance standards. Stay curious, stay informed, and I'll catch you next time.
If you found this helpful or want to stay updated when this regulation changes, subscribe and support the channel. And if you need the full technical details on this CFR, click the link in the description below. See you next time.